What war were you involved in?
Korean War.
What prompted you to join the war?
I didn't just go into the Korean War. I'd been in the Marine Corps for 2 years before the war occurred. But the reason why I went in the Marine Corps is because there were Marines and Navy personnel here in Laguna Beach, all during Second World War, and they were pretty much my heroes.
What was being in combat like?
When you first go in, the first time, you wonder, are you going to make it? Not only get killed, but are you going to be able to perform? Because, I mean, in my situation, I'd seen all the pictures, and not only motion pictures, but field pictures and newsreels of World War II, seeing people being shot at and actually killed, some of them. And all you wonder, well, how am I going to do? I had a silly thing. I was born, when I was born, I had asthma, was born with congenital asthma and hay fever, and I was afraid, though as I got older and in my later teens, and I was now 19, it pretty much went away. And I thought, what if I'm this big, bad, red-headed Marine, and I'm on the front lines and grubbing around, and I get hay fever and start sneezing, and all. You know, that's dumb, but that was a very real fear. I wasn't so much afraid of getting killed as I was afraid of making a fool of myself. You're wondering if, you know, how you're going to perform in relationship to your buddies and other people that are doing the same thing, making a landing, jumping off of a ship into a landing craft with a pack of about 80 pounds or so, and then going on the beach and getting shot at the beach. Are you going to, you know, are you going to perform? Not so much as are you going to live.
Could you explain the safe pass?
They were dropped from C-47 airplanes. They dumped hundreds and hundreds of those. The philosophy was to let these combatants, Chinese and North Korean, know that if they wanted to give up and come to the American side, or the South Koreans, the safe pass was a contract that if you come to us and you want to lay down your arms and be non-combatant, that you will be treated with respect, but there was to be no torture and really not a lot of confinement.
How were the prisoners of war treated in your unit?
As we were going ahead sometimes, almost accidentally or of necessity, we would find prisoners. And we'd usually assign a couple of our people. They were ready, believe me, they weren't firing at us, or they wanted to give up and get out of what they were in. You know, we would be up on the front, and we'd be moving along, and we'd gather prisoners and then send them on back to a staging area. As far as I could tell, they were treated very well. They were confined, but in staging areas rather than cells. And they had tents, you know, that were probably as good as the ones we had.
What are some of your most memorable experiences?
There was something kind of neat that I saw on the way from Wonsan up to Ham Hung. We were going along, and here was an older man. He's probably 15 years younger than I am right now, but he had all this wonderful white hair and his beautiful sparkling blue eyes, and he was a Methodist minister. And the communists pushed him out of his church, burned his church down. But what was left he had on this great big old flatbed truck with most of his congregation. And he pulled over to the side of the road, and we came up to him, and our officers were talking to him, and I tuned in on the conversation. And he had this wonderful spirit. And here he'd he'd been there since 1926 or 7, and this is 1950. You know, he'd been there all those years and established this parish. And one of the officers said, well, Pastor, what are you going to do next? And these beautiful blue eyes lighted up. We're going to rebuild. We're going to rebuild. Anyway, what an impression that man made on me. One of the most memorable experiences was when we had to wait for a while outside of Incheon, which was the first major invasion in Korea after the war had started. And some of the infantry went in first to kind of clear the decks, because air control people often had other kinds of equipment that we had to take with us. And while we served on the front, often some of our equipment had to be just a little bit behind the front lines. And I think the memorable experiences, all this fighting, all the artillery from the battleships and all, they're all these Navy ships sending rounds of ammunition in to prepare the way for us for either at least 2 days, if not 3. And so we'd go up on deck at night and watch all that going on. And it wasn't so much fearful, it was just wondering sort of what's next. The memorable experience was coming down the ladder way and then jumping into the LCD landing craft the first time. And then of course when the landing craft got to a part of the beach and storming off the landing craft onto the ground, and we were pinned down by fire, and we had to go to a little island area called Wamido, and we were stuck there for most of the night. And then of course when dawn came, and that was a memorable experience. I'll never forget that night, I think, as long as I live.
What war were you involved in?
Actually, Stephanie, I was a very lucky man. I was not involved in a war. The time that I served in was between the Korean War and the Vietnamese War. So 1960 to 62 fell exactly between the two wars. I was in what they called the Cold War.
Which period of time were you in the service?
I was in the U.S. Army from October of 1960 through September 1962.
How did you arrive in Germany?
Well, before I arrived in Germany, I was drafted. Uncle Sam sent me a message that says, "Boy, I need you." And I went down to the draftee station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They loaded me on a train and sent me to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I went through basic training. From there I went to Fort Hood, Texas, where I went through armor training and driving. And from Fort Hood, Texas, straight to Germany. Took a troop ship from Brooklyn, New York, with 1,500 troops on board, and we landed at Bremerhaven, Germany 10 days later. They had a train waiting dockside. I got off the boat onto the train. The train took me to the post where I was going to be stationed. And it was my misfortune when I got to the post. It was the middle of February, still cold and very snowy. And I found out my unit had just shipped out for the field the day before. So I got to sleep in the bed one night. They loaded us on what they call a deuce-and-a-half truck. And they drove us 300 miles to the Czechoslovakian border, where I spent the next 40 days out in the field, in the snow.
What was your job or assignment?
My job assignment when I served in the Army was I was the driver of an armored vehicle. It was a mechanized personnel carrier that had a 4-deuce mortar mounted inside. The diameter of the shell that it fired was 4.2 inches. And the purpose of my unit was to do close maneuvers with the tanks, and we were actually an artillery unit that followed very closely behind the tanks. We not only fired high explosive shells, but illumination shells which furnished light for the tankers to see and fire at their targets. It was my fortune to have been in Germany at the time the Berlin Wall was built. When they started building the wall, it was August of 1961. And Khrushchev had given us 48 hours to get out of Berlin. So in the middle of the night, the whistle blew in our barracks, and that was an alert signal. We had to run down to the motor pool, crank up all the armored vehicles, and we drove about 75 miles to the East German border and stayed there for 2 weeks. We had no idea if the war was starting or if it was just another alert. It was very close to a conflict, so fortunately they worked out the problem. Khrushchev went back to Russia where he belonged, and we went back to the barracks. Thank God.
What are some of your most memorable experiences?
Well, when you're in the service, you have good and bad experiences. Now, some of the worst experiences, I'll start with the bad first, was the weather. The weather in Germany was absolutely horrid. In the summer, it rained all the time, and any time you went on maneuvers, which was almost constantly, because I was in an armored outfit, you were sleeping in the mud and the rain. You ate your breakfast and lunch and dinner in the rain, and maybe once every 2 weeks you get a chance to go back to the main tent in the village of Grafenwehr and get a hot meal and a shower. The good times was the leave of absence that you were able to take and travel around Europe and mingling with the German people.
Was it worth spending 2 years of your life in the service?
Stephanie, 2 of the finest years I've ever had. Wearing this patch was one of the finest times of my life. It meant keeping my family and your family safe. And that was the least I could do for my country. I'll do it anytime. Thank you for the interview, Stephanie.